Good afternoon and welcome back to the CogX Festival. My name is Anushka Sharma. I'm the founder of tech and space innovation consultancy Naaut, and I'm delighted to be your MC today. Greetings and welcome to the Planet and Smart Cities stage. Joining me next, we have Christopher Mason, who's the Associate Professor at the Department of Physiology and Biophysics at Weill Cornell Medicine. On the next 500 years, engineering for space, this is our new session. In 2015, NASA astronaut Scott Kelly went to space while his identical twin stayed here on Earth, leading to some very surprising discoveries on how space travel affects the human body. Christopher Mason was the head geneticist at the time, who shared the unexpected twists and turns of the groundbreaking study. And today he's going to take us through the next 500-year roadmap for humans to create a new and sustainable societies, even on other planets. And it's all about undertaking a massive, ambitious project of re-engineering human genetics for life on other worlds. It's an honor to welcome to CogX Christopher Mason. Christopher, how are you? Welcome.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
It's really wonderful to have you with us. We can see the time. You're based in California currently. Yes. Let's dive in. I have been poring over this book and I've not been able to put it down since I got it. And I've annotated it in line with the work that I do. And I feel like you've given me a really fantastic benchmark of things to kind of go and dive into. But could you give us, before we dive into the book, an overview of the work you do?
My pleasure. So yeah, you can see the book there on the screen. So again, a pleasure to be here. Really excited to be at the festival. And what we normally do in the lab is a lot of work in clinical genetics and also the computational methods to analyze those data and put them together into frameworks or what's called systems biology, which just means integrating as many data types as possible across as many cells to understand cancer, for example, or changes during cancer during therapy, like epigenetic changes, which I talk about a lot in the book. But then we use a lot of these same tools in the past real decade to apply the cutting edge methods that we use for cancer patients at the hospital to better understand the impact of spaceflight on the human body and how we can learn really from Scott Kelly and other astronauts what happens to the body and then figure out what are the highest risk loci to target or to fix, in some cases even to prevent some of the damage before it happens. And so really, we're just taking modern medicine and applying it to space and to astronauts. And so the lab does a lot of work in the sequencing, the analysis, the clinical genetics, the workup, and also work with blood, stool, urine, really any biospecimen from any part of the body often tells a story. And so we try to listen to every story from each cell in the human body on Earth or in space.
Yeah, it's fantastic because I think the NASA twin study outlined some fantastic developments around telomeres, even changes to mitochondria. Could you tell us more about some of the outcomes of the twin study, which has led you on to this journey of writing this book?
Yeah, so that study was really, actually I started the lab in 2010. I wrote these 10 bullet points of what I think could be the next 500 years. And at the time, I really thought, well, we need more studies of astronauts using molecular methods and genetic methods. There had been very few studies that used the more recent tools in molecular biology, and there had been no studies that had used the whole genome sequencing or a lot of the genomics methods on astronauts. And so I thought about that even in 2010 and wrote that as kind of the beginning plan for the lab. It started as many things do on a bar napkin with a bullet point pen, just kind of scribbling down ideas. But that became really the goal in the manifesto for what I think we should do over the next 500 years. And I'll get into that shortly about the book. But I really, of course, I'll be dead for most of that plan. I don't plan to live for 500 years. I just think it's one of the most human things you can do is to craft a plan that exceeds your lifetime. It's actually a very unique feature of humans. So we were very fortunate in 2014, NASA announced they were planning the study and wanted people to submit ideas. So we were one of the 10 teams selected. It was a very large effort, but I was heading a lot of all the genetics work and the workup for the astronauts and the long-term follow-up. I actually just had a call yesterday with some of them because we're following them long-term. And we really wanted to say, okay, well, let's study everything we possibly can about what happens to a body in space. So we looked at what happens at the genetic level, also epigenetics to see how gene expression is changing and how it's regulated. And then also RNA, we looked at proteins, we looked at the immune system, the vasculature, for example. We also looked at cognitive traits and really the full kitchen sink of molecular biology. And we found some surprising things. So for example, his telomeres, which are the indicator of often aging as they shrink as you age, they actually got longer in space. So what you might think would be an unusual, it's kind of like the fountain of youth in space, some people called it, but it did go away when it got back to Earth. It didn't last forever. And we've since confirmed this in actually 11 other astronauts. It actually seems to be a pretty consistent feature of spaceflight. We also saw a lot of mitochondrial stress. So mitochondria are normally what are in your cells making the energy, what's called ATP, to help your cells have fuel. And we saw these actually being stressed and even ejected into the bloodstream during flight, which had never been seen before. And so that was also kind of a surprising result. And also we saw like the microbiome change, but that went back to normal. A lot of his cytokines, which are these measures of immune stress and signaling between cells, some of them really spiked up high the day that he landed after a year in flight. And we saw that this was really, in some cases, for some of them, the highest measures ever seen for any patient or any astronaut. So a year in space really was hard on the body when Scott landed, but he also recovered quickly from that. So what we learned is that the body is extraordinarily plastic and has a lot of physiological and molecular and genetic changes, but that most of them do revert back to normal pretty quickly. So it actually was a testament to the plasticity of human physiology, I'd say, at the end of it all.
Which is really kind of what brings us to where we are today, and where technology and different fields within the space ecosystem are kind of coming together in this kind of interoperable, collaborative way. Can you talk to us now about the book and dive more into that? Because I understand that, there's the science of exoplanets, and not everybody on this call may be aware of what an exoplanet is. Or do you mind explaining how that ties into some of the genomics work that you've uncovered?
Happy to. So this is really, what's exciting is the book, when I wrote it, if I'd written this 20 years ago or even 25 years ago, it would have been pretty much science fiction. Actually, a lot of the ideas in the book were only made possible by recent technological developments. And so I think what's really exciting is there have been two big engines of discovery that enable this book to become projection of science of today into the future versus science fiction. So the two big engines are just, one is DNA sequencing and the ability to sequence genomes, and even to have a human genome that we can look at as a reference, and also to look at microbial genetics, to look at really any organism that we find in the space station or in your gut or in your skin, or obviously in your human cells. So this ability to quickly and accurately map the genetics of any ecosystem or any patient didn't really exist until recently. So there was no human genome until 2001. It really didn't get completed until 2003. And there's even some gaps that are still just being finished even as late as this year. So, these are all recent developments that enable the highest possible resolution of what's happening at the fundamental genetic level during spaceflight. And so that was one thing. And we're also finding new human genes, new organisms, new viruses. For example, CRISPR technology, most people have heard about as a way to edit DNA that we learned from bacteria that we didn't even start capturing until the mid-90s, and didn't even realize what it was until really about 15 years ago, and that it could be used, which recently led to a Nobel Prize by Doudna and Charpentier. So there is this extraordinary work in genomics just in the past 25 years that really couldn't have been predicted, but now makes it possible to sequence genomes, to even start to synthesize genomes and have this real genetic fountain of discovery. The second really big engine of discovery is in exoplanets, which is this fact that we now have, the first exoplanet was found in 1992, which just means it's a planet that is around a different star. So exoplanet just meaning outside of the solar system. And again, 25 years ago, there was one exoplanet that had been barely discovered, but now there are thousands and thousands of exoplanets. Actually, several hundred of them look like they're in what would be called the habitable zone. So it means that they're probably at the right distance from the sun and have the right mass to potentially have an atmosphere as well as liquid water and be at a right temperature where humans could go there and potentially survive today. So between these two engines, we now have the biochemical knowledge and biological understanding of what happens in cells and what we have as a reference inside, for the human genome, and also ways to modify or tweak the genomes. And we also have places that we know we can go. So when you put these two together, it made it possible for me to write a really concrete plan for 500 years, which sounds like an oxymoron, but it's possible because we can lay out what do we know genetically and what are the risk factors and how can you address them, which we do in clinic today, for example, for cancer patients. And then what are the planets that would be good candidates and how could we go there and could we survive there? And then what we would need to do to adapt to maybe survive there. So I laid this all out in the book because, the time has finally occurred where we have the know-how and also the knowledge of where to go. So I think it's really an unprecedented time.
I think that's the wonderful thing about where we are right now is you can't control timing, and it's all of these things currently converging. And so now as we look to accelerate the opportunity for human spaceflight, whether it's commercial opportunities or space tourism, we'll have many more people having access to space in the next decade, if not earlier. And so, the human body isn't really resilient to being in space, and we have the tests that are being done on the International Space Station. You have the long-term study you did with the NASA twin study. NASA and other such agencies are now working in collaboration to send astronauts back to the moon. So the first female astronaut may well be the first female on the moon, but equally, we in parallel are using that as the trajectory of moving back to Mars. And bear with me, because yesterday we were discussing with Professor Sanjeev Gupta about, is there life on Mars? And we have sample return missions on the surface of Mars, which will be returning samples physically here to Earth in 2030. And if we do find those microbes that are resistant to that radiation, because there's no magnetosphere that protects the surface of Mars in the way that we are protected here on Earth, then how will that impact on the work you've described in the book if we are able to bring back samples of microbes that may potentially have resistance to radiation? It's happening. Like, this is actually not science fiction. This is truly happening right now.
It's occurring. And actually, I have a whole section in the book that describes some of these questions about planetary protection, which is a division of NASA that seeks, as well as international agreements called COSPAR, which is basically making sure that when we send any spacecraft to another planet, that we don't contaminate that planet, or at least we avoid it as best we can. And if we bring anything back to Earth, that we don't have what's called reverse contamination, where we bring back a potentially dangerous or disruptive organism to Earth. So in both directions, these have been always a little bit science fiction, or they haven't been urgent. But now we actually have the Mars sample return mission, as you just referred to. It'll probably be collected in 2030 and hopefully returned to Earth by 2032. And this is a collaboration between NASA and the European Space Agency to work together on this. And it really opens this extraordinary period where we now we have to figure out what to do with these Martian rocks. And of course, the cool thing would be we can look at them biochemically, we can look at them, let's say, with mass spectrometry, or you can look at them with sequencing, or look to see, is there DNA there? It would be very easy to see. If there's DNA, we just quickly extract it and look for the nucleic acids or even modified versions of them. So we might be able to answer, is there life on Mars, in a very concrete way, and have the physical samples in our hands within a decade, which is pretty extraordinary. And so, but one of the things we need to do as soon as it comes back here, and I describe this a bit in the book, is you have to have, if you think you found life on Mars that's DNA, you need to be able to compare it to all of the DNA that's ever been seen on Earth, including in the spacecraft assembly facilities where they build these robots and rovers. And so we've been working with NASA and JPL to actually do sequencing of those clean rooms during the production. So we'll basically build a filter of anything that's been seen there. And then we compare this to every piece of DNA or RNA that's ever been sequenced and observed on Earth. And then we can quickly filter out to say, has this been observed ever anywhere on Earth or anything close to it? And if the answer is still no, then we can say, at least to the best of our knowledge, any piece of DNA that has been found, if it has no match to anything on Earth, it's a decent chance that that's actually a distinct Martian, evidence of life, basically. So this is we're very excited, because it's something that was been, again, hypothetical 10, 20 years ago, but now we have the indexed method, the way that you catalog and summarize and organize all of the data for all genetic material on Earth. And we have samples coming back. So it's really exciting time that we might have a really concrete answer to that question of are we alone?
I know, and I sense that your book is causing many ripples in space agencies around the world. And in fact, I was listening to Jim Green, who's the CTO of NASA, and he was talking about one of the biggest breakthroughs of our lifetime, even bigger than discovering the double helix of DNA, would be discovering the biological sequence of a microbe that lives off Earth. Now, it might be on an asteroid, because we also have the sample return from an asteroid with the Japanese Space Agency. It truly is an international effort, isn't it? And are these sort of data sets being shared collaboratively around the world?
Yes, they are. So actually, we started something, an international space omics sort of organization that includes Roscosmos, JAXA, ESA, NASA, other space agencies, to share data, to share methods, share best practices, even just very simple, basic tools of how you actually do the science. We've started a lot of these groups. We have meetings every few weeks and really get together as an international team, because we all benefit when we all share the science and the tools and especially the data. So this is something that historically has been difficult because people often don't share as readily as they could. And this is not just true for space agencies. A lot of times medical centers have a lot of really robust and useful clinical data, but they don't often share it with other hospitals. And that too is getting better. I think we've actually seen with COVID, one thing that's been made abundantly clear is that the speed with which we can work to develop technologies and address global crises is rapidly accelerated if we just share and collaborate internationally between academic and industry sites, government sites. So I think we're seeing a lot more of this collaboration. It's also been made easier. We can all just Zoom or FaceTime with people anywhere in the world. So that is also made it much more possible. But it's been a lot of collaboration is really getting off the ground and has already occurred, I'd say. So hopefully we'll see a lot more of that in the years to come.
That's fantastic. And for anyone listening, Roscosmos is the Russian space agency,
yes.
JAXA is the Japanese space agency, Eastern European Space Agency. This is a new audience that are learning about space, and we're bringing them through with the agenda. And it's so interesting because when we talk about going to Mars, we often hear about, in the general narrative, about terraforming Mars and terraforming the planet. And I'm often struck that we seem to focus on humans and plants for our sustainable, like being able to grow our own food, for instance. But what we don't do is talk about taking animals and the complex bio-ecosystems of Earth with us as living inhabitants. Now, obviously, there's a massive ethical consequence of that, and you've touched on that with planetary protection both ways. Yes. But that's why I found it so profound that, I think, would you like to talk about some of the reasons of why we might need to look at a future off Earth, which might lead on to why you've included the bio-ecosystem of our planet of living species?
Yes, and I argue in the book that it's not just a technical question or a curiosity to go. Most people think, well, why should we go to space? We have poverty and there's social inequities and injustices and many clear problems on Earth. Why should we spend time and energy and resources to go out to space? And I think we can do both, though. We can address inequities and inequality and social problems here and poverty, disease. We can do that all on Earth while we are also going towards space, as we've done already for decades as a species. But when we start to think about going to the other planets, I argue this is not just for exploration. It's not just for the going, just for the sake of going. It is actually a moral duty in the sense that we are the only species with awareness of extinction. And if you assume that life has value, which I do, that has value that needs to be preserved, inevitably we will have to leave Earth. If you just look out 1 billion years, I think all moral questions become crystal clear through the lens of 1 billion-year time frame. The oceans will start to boil. We literally can't stay here. Any life that's been preserved, that's as beautiful and wonderful as it might be, if it's still here, eventually the sun will engulf the inner planets. And so it's not a question of if we leave, it's only when. And so this assumes two things: that one that will survive that long, which I do. I'm optimistic about humans. I think not only can we, but that we should morally, and that we eventually have to. And also assumes that we can get somewhere, that we have somewhere we can go, but we now know of planets we can go to. So I think it's actually a moral argument that we have to be the guardians, really the shepherds of life itself, because no other organism has this awareness. And so it is incumbent upon us as a duty for our species to be really the guardians and protectors of life. And you could say, well, why us? Couldn't someone else do it? I'd be happy if someone else did it, but to our knowledge, we're the only ones who can. And so if we find another alien life form that is doing it with us, great. But right now, it's just us, as far as we know, in the entire universe that has this capacity, this cognitive ability to understand extinction, and more importantly, to prevent it. Of course, we don't have a perfect track record. We've caused extinctions. But at the same time, as I also describe in the book, we're beginning to de-extinctify certain species, such as the woolly mammoth. We're working with the Revive and Restore project on that right now, is beginning the work of, can we correct some of the wrongs that we've done ecologically? And it raises big ethical questions as well. What if you return a species back to the ecosystem, but it's more destructive than when it's gone? And so you have to do things like anything you do with clinical care. You start slowly, you do clinical trials, you introduce a few members of the species. You do things very carefully and very slowly, but we actually now have the technology to do these things. This is not science fiction. We're doing it in my lab today.
I mean, I'm sure everyone watching are literally like mind blown, and I've had chance to process the book over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
But I mean, like literally, my mind is blown, and I'm sure many people watching us will have questions. And in fact, this is your opportunity to pop them in. I do apologize because my gardener has started to trim the hedge next door, and I think my Wi-Fi might be a bit slow. But I'd love to understand a little bit more from you around like the gaps in science in the next, say, 10 to 20 years, because obviously we've got commercial and private companies. There's a logo behind you.
Oh yeah, yes.
That are trying to, so that are trying to, take the space hopper, for example, in the case of SpaceX, and land on the surface of Mars in the next couple of years by their own, like arguably their own timeline. Yeah. It is a very different timeline to the technology that you're talking about. Will you have an opportunity to test something in line with other operations that are happening? And if you are intending to, have you started the kind of like collaborative process in that kind of time frame?
Yes, we have. And so I would even say, which we could do, one thing we could do is to share on my screen. Actually, I think it might be in Backstage, is just to show what's, I'll kind of walk people through this a little bit of what's coming. So this is one of the images from the book, which is what's happened in the past 50, 60 years between biotechnology, between medical treatments and cellular engineering or developmental biology, and how has that impacted life expectancy and society. And so I describe a lot of what's happened and then what's coming soon. So for example, this is a very dense and rich slide, and also the figure in the book covers a lot of this. But what you can see here is actually, across time, various tools we've learned about how evolution has created certain adaptations. For example, Tibetans who can survive in very low oxygen environments, or we've taken a gene from a tardigrade, which is this tiny little water bear that can survive in the vacuum of space, taken genes from that organism and then put them into human cells to get them to resist radiation much better. So we can basically take the evolutionary lessons of any species and apply them potentially to other species, as what I describe here. And this has led to, the first time something appears is a little lollipop. The first time something has been used in the clinic is kind of the syringe. And then when it shows the sort of medical symbol, that's when something is approved and clinically widely used. And it's really been an extraordinary few decades, because we now have all these tools that we know have recently occurred, like a lot of gene editing methods, but also a lot of things that I think are pending, and including like these new missions that you were just alluding to. For example, the Starshot, if you look at towards the bottom, is a way you could actually have a fast-moving satellite, essentially be with laser power, go towards another sun, get close enough to the speed of light to get there within our lifetimes, and actually give us a little bit of data and send it back to us. And so, there are some plans like that. There are plans to go to the outer planets. There's multiple missions for Venus that have been announced. And so I describe, a lot of what will happen in the next, I think, few decades. But then I'll go here quickly to the next page here. So as you can see here, is if you look even further into the future, I do imagine, though, that we'll see even more profound changes. We'll start to see a better understanding of, if people have been in space enough time, do they have adaptations that enable them to live in space better, or to potentially someday to live on Mars better. And I put that more in the 2100s, 2200s, that if enough people are living on Mars, eventually we will learn the evolutionary adaptations of us living, say, in space or Mars, and then be able to deploy them, maybe medically, and say, this is what you need, either this molecule or this microbe or this adaptation of some kind to get you to survive on other planets. And I describe even more fun concepts in the book, like chlorophyll inside of human cells. Could you, if you're in a place that's far away from Earth, could you have photosynthesis in your cells? And that way you could take every photon that you get and capture it and use it for energy. So I describe that also as the fun calculation of how much skin you would need in order to do that. Quick preview, the answer is about 2 tennis courts if you want to sit out for 1 hour of sunlight. But then we even think, further into the future, looking at, say, going to Titan. Could you have people by 2300 who make it to Titan, even try and survive there? I think this will happen. I think also other technologies that will enable babies to be born in wombs that are artificial. There's a lot of technology that's made it so you can almost have an entire gestation and birth be done through what are called exo wombs or artificial wombs. That will, I think, advance and accelerate a lot of tools. And also, I think life expectancy eventually in either orbiting systems or Mars will start to hopefully eventually approach what we see on Earth. But I think in the near term, it'll be harder to survive on Mars than it would be on Earth. And again, all of this is not because we need to leave Earth in the short term. We do eventually need to leave. And also this makes it just that we can be on two planets and have a bit of a, some people call it plan B, that Mars is just in case something goes wrong with Earth. But I like to say Mars and subsequent planets, they're not plan B, they're just plan A. It's really just about survival and really enacting this duty as a species to preserve not only our own butts, but also the other organisms on Earth that are fairly precious and rare in the universe as far as we know.
So you've conceptualized time, and obviously that's quite hard for humans sometimes. I think in your book, like one of the first things you say is like, look around you and imagine where you are and how it will be and every item around you in 100 years.
Yes.
So it's even like trying to think like that very kind of mindfully of like, what do we have? And, this is a time where, we're thinking about our planet. And I personally do believe that we need to solve every kind of technical challenge we can to make our planet better. And if a subsequent effect of that is us going back to the moon and Mars and technology that comes back to helps our planet, then that's for the greater good. Now, obviously, there's some fantastic science that you've outlined that will help humans on Earth. But in a billion years' time, if we are in a different position, the sun's energy burns out, or even before that, where we're about to go into solar wind cycles in the next 5 to 10 years that might knock out satellites and GPS and electric systems, much like the Carrington effect. These sorts of scenarios, much like the COVID pandemic, are coming thick and fast. And we're also about to go into a portion of the Milky Way where there are near-Earth asteroids that, like the dinosaurs had to contend with. There's 1,000 of which I believe are very potentially dangerous to us. So there's a whole reason why this has come about. We've had a question from our audience, and I may have explained earlier on to yourself, I'm not sure if I did to our audience, but at CogX, we also have a whole stage around the ethics of technology and applying technology. So Laura Zhu has asked, Chris, how do you go about exploring and discussing the underlying moral and ethical assumptions that you've stated just before arriving to your conclusions, or are these personal beliefs?
I think so. I'm happy to give some background. I have a lot of the beginning of the book is a lot about duty and the ethics of this, which is a key part of it, because I think the way I think about it is actually a resolution of a long-standing, I think, tension between consequentialist philosophy, or like what John Stuart Mill wrote about utilitarianism, where you say what's the greatest good for the greatest number, versus Kantian ethics, which are what are called the categorical imperative, where you think, imagine any action you're about to take as an axiom for everyone else, or if you did something and everyone did it, what would the world look like? So these two moral philosophies are often seen as at odds with each other. But I describe it because, I view my view of this sort of series of future necessities is simply just a matter of fact. I don't think it's an opinion that the sun will get bigger and run out of fuel. That's just a fact, right? So it's not assuming our knowledge is correct, which it still could be wrong in some places, but as far as we know, it happens to every sun. So if that's true, you just have to think, well, what should we do? And assuming that humans live that long, it's just a combination of these two facts. And so I think the question, what you do ethically, though, in the face of such facts, builds on something what I call as a deontogenic framework, which means sort of a genetic duty. The genic is the essentially the genetics part, and the deontos, the study of our duty. That root and this, what I propose is a new sort of antecedent ethical framework that is before consequentialism or the categorical imperative, is because you need to be alive in order to enact any of the things that you hold that have value. And so the survival of the species and all species really evolves life has to be the top priority in order to enable any other goal of humanity or any ethical system of anything at all. So what I like to say is just that existence precedes the essence of something. It's kind of the opposite of a Platonic form. So I'm not much of a Platonist, but it means that if you're not here, you can't do any of the things that you hold to have value or enact them or preserve them. So the whatever can enable this preservation is something that is what is holds the highest ethical value in what's called this Deontogenic Framework.
Yeah, it's so interesting because that chapter on the Deontogenic society that you outline really like drives into that. And in the science community, you know, scientists put themselves out there with their work, and then your peers, you know, will talk to you and agree and disagree and challenge you on certain things. I'd love to know how the science and wider community have received your ideas and what outcomes you've experienced so far.
So yeah, it's been a lot of excitement. Actually, Jim Green recently he called, it was the head scientist at NASA. He said this is a game changer. This idea of thinking about, you know, all aspects of biology that we can use and protect, so that we can have, you know, better understanding and safer missions. He was a big fan of it, and then other people have said this is really extraordinary. Some people have thought that the ideas of any kind of genetic engineering are controversial or dangerous, and I point to that in the book that there, you know, you have to do anything when you're thinking about even genetic or epigenetic changes. Really, any medical treatment of any kind, nothing is without risk, right? And you have to always be at the stage where the benefits of any proposed treatment or therapy or idea outweighs the risks, and you have to. It is complicated because it's hard enough for one life, but also what I propose in the book is this thinking has to transcend what has historically been a very limited single patient view of risk. This is actually an intergenerational risk when you start to think about genome engineering or engineering ecosystems. But it doesn't mean that we're not already doing it today. We are kind of accidentally engineering ecosystems and in some cases even patients. And now we could actually do it with volition. And it's also a very large project. And this idea of having the hubris to think we could modify genes in species or multiple species or whole ecosystems or terraform. All these are gigantic and extraordinarily, you know, large projects that require us thinking, well, we know what's best, and that we have the pride and the hubris to decide this. But as far as we know, no one else can. And, you know, the scale of the project doesn't obviate its necessity. And so I think it is something that we have to do and have to embrace. I think is one of the more human things that we can do.
Yeah, and of course, this is where it becomes very personal for people as they receive this book based on their own personal beliefs as well. And that all plays a part in now how we now debate this and think about the general implications of technology. And as you say, you know, genetic engineering, we're already having repercussions in environments on Earth with genetically modified materials, you know, growing soya in parts of the world where rainforests are being felled. There are wider conversations to have about this. I'm going to do one last call from our audience to see if you have any questions. And Chris, if you, I would imagine that there are many brilliant minds. We have policymakers, creatives, artists, entrepreneurs, CEOs, executives all watching us. What would you like to say to them? How might they get involved in some of the work you've described? Where is there a need for, I don't want to say outsiders, but collaborators and like future strategic partners to get involved?
It can be as simple as helping to analyze a data set that's been made. So from undergraduates to high school students, to graduates, we have medical fellows and residents and graduate students who all help with these projects. So there is one project at NASA, for example, called Gene Lab, which is a repository of all publicly available data from mice or plants or animals that have flown into space. So some of it could be as simple as playing with a data set and trying to better understand what happens in space to biology, to all organisms. That's useful. Working with medical centers like ours at Weill Cornell Medicine, so coming there and you can work in the lab. Sometimes you can volunteer. Obviously, you could be hired as a job, but I think it's a real, it's a team effort. You just need to, if you can join commercial entities like SpaceX, Blue Origin are in the news a lot lately. They're doing a lot of work. They have a lot of goals to actually get science into space as well as the crews. So you can, work with them, volunteer. You can analyze data sets. You can join some of these either schools or companies or NASA, for example. You could go to NASA and work with them. But I think the other thing is to also push for the entrepreneurship, sort of the creation of new companies that can support this kind of work and new technologies that could work in space. new medicines that can help, say, protect against radiation. So anything that you're doing that might be just seem like it's earthbound and just simple for a patient on Earth, but it may actually have a great benefit for patients that eventually fly to Mars. And so I think even just basic funding of medicine and biomedical applications of new therapies here on Earth almost invariably has some translational impact on what we do when humans are far from Earth. So even calling your senators and Congress people and saying, hey, we should have more funding for science, that all helps, since we can work faster.
Yeah, I think definitely the UK science community would love some funding as much as the tech community get that from VCs, or VCs, if you could direct your attention to innovative science, would be amazing. There's actually a really cool experiment that's gone up to the International Space Station a few weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, and it's the University of Nottingham have sent worms into space to see how they respond, like the muscles. They want to look at how the muscles are kind of reacting in the worms. So a lot of those sorts of science-based kind of research projects do pool into wider science kind of sort of papers that come out. And it's great to see that the UK is also sending stuff up and experiments to the ISS. Chris, I know you've got a lot on your plate at the moment. You're a very busy man. I just want to say thank you so much for joining us at CogX. Hopefully we'll get to host you here in person next year. I know we're gunning for it to be hybrid, but hopefully in person, very much so. Thank you from everyone here on the Planet stage. And if you have any final words, we'd love to hear them. And I actually personally, you can see how much I've dissected your book. I do highly recommend it. And I'm not just saying that. It definitely is very thought-provoking and provocative and profound in equal measure. So get the book.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for the book plug. It really is when it says the next 500 years, some people have said it seems daunting. I don't know if I can pick up a book that's so far in the future, but I actually think this is really everyone's birthright. As a human, you have the innate capacity to plan long term. And I think this is a book that is a collection of everything, not only that I hope that we can do, but it's actually all grounded in experiments and data and tools that exist today. So like I said, I think a few decades ago it would have been science fiction, but today it is a fairly reasonable projection of everything based on science that we have in our hands that we know it just needs to be optimized or expanded. So I think everyone should have an extraordinary sense of awe and I think optimism and enthusiasm for the era in which we live in, because it is really, every day is quantitatively the best day ever to be a geneticist. There's more data that's ever existed than ever before. All the launches going into space, there are more launches per year than ever before in the last 2 years, and it's going to certainly surpass it this year. So we really are becoming a spacefaring species. We are becoming an engineering species down to DNA, and this can have, and it already has had profound impact on how we can treat disease, but actually how we can maybe get to Mars and someday farther. So I think it's really nothing short of the best era ever to live in. So, and we're all living it, so it's a great time. And a lot of that's enthusiasm and optimism, and some of the ethical framework for it is also in the book. So hopefully people enjoy it, and thank you for having me.
No, thank you so much. That's Chris Mason there, who's joined us to talk about the next 500 years engineering life for space. Chris, thank you so much. You are tuned in to the Planet and Smart City stage on day 2 of CogX. I'm Anushka, I'm your MC. It was awesome to have Christopher Mason join us, currently beaming in from California. Coming up next at 5 p.m. British Standard Time, we have a keynote from Bill Gross, who's going to be talking to us about radical ideas to save our planet. So go and stretch your legs, get a glass of water, hydrate, go and enjoy some sunshine, and we'll see you back here in just over 20 minutes. Thank you.